The United States war on drugs stands as one of the most enduring policy campaigns in modern American history. Initiated in the early 1970s under President Richard Nixon, it was anchored by the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which introduced the Controlled Substances Act and established the framework for categorizing and regulating narcotics. In 1973, Nixon also oversaw the creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, consolidating federal drug enforcement efforts. Over more than 5 decades, the campaign has shaped domestic law enforcement, international relations, and public health policy. While its stated mission was to curb drug use and dismantle trafficking networks, its legacy is defined by mass incarceration, strained community trust in government institutions, and persistent debates over reform. After a decade of Nixon's declaration of an all-out offensive on drugs, addiction rates remained stubbornly high. Cocaine and marijuana use showed little decline, and the expansion of illicit black markets revealed that prohibition was failing to reduce demand. At the same time, Dr. Vincent Dole and Dr. Marie Niswander pioneered methadone maintenance therapy, achieving notable success in treating Vietnam combat veterans struggling with opioid addiction. Although controversial, methadone programs stood out as a rare constructive experiment of the 1970s, contrasting sharply with the failures of mass incarceration and punitive enforcement. Beyond U.S. borders, the campaign fueled escalating cartel violence in Latin America, where efforts to suppress trafficking often intensified conflict and instability rather than resolving it. These outcomes underscored a critical divide. When drug policy is shaped primarily by a political body of knowledge, strategies emphasize interdiction, crop eradication, and court penalties. By contrast, when guided by a scientific body of knowledge, policy draws on facts and theories about drug use, offering treatment-based approaches that address addiction as a public health issue rather than solely a criminal one. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the war on drugs entered a pivotal escalation. Building on the foundations laid in the 1970s, Reagan's administration transformed drug policy into a central domestic and cultural issue. Through mandatory sentencing laws, public campaigns, and responses to the crack epidemic, the 1980s entrenched punitive approaches that reshaped the American criminal justice system and had lasting social consequences. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 introduced mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which imposed fixed prison terms for drug offenses regardless of context. Most notably, the legislation established a 100-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Possession of just 5 grams of crack carried the same penalty as 500 grams of powder cocaine. Parallel to developments in the United States, Latin American nations passed laws expanding enforcement and militarization under U.S. pressure. Mexico expanded federal jurisdiction over drug crimes and increased military involvement in eradication campaigns. Peru and Bolivia adopted coca eradication and anti-trafficking laws, often targeting traditional coca cultivation beyond designated legal zones. In Colombia, after years of cartel violence, President Andrés Pastrana introduced Plan Colombia in 1999, formally launched in 2000 with U.S. support under President Bill Clinton. The initiative aimed to combat drug cartels, weaken insurgent groups such as the FARC, and strengthen the Colombian economy and institutions. While these measures reflected alignment with U.S. policy, they often intensified violence, displaced rural populations, and fueled corruption, underscoring the complex consequences of militarized drug enforcement in the region. The war on drugs and the Cold War converged to create one of the most complex and destructive policy environments in Latin America. Drug trafficking, covert operations, and subversion often intersected, as intelligence agencies, insurgent groups, and criminal networks relied on the same smuggling routes and funding streams. This overlap revealed that efforts to wage war on drugs were undermined by geopolitical strategies that tolerated or even leveraged narcotics trade. Within this environment, several covert networks emerged, the most powerful of which was the Enterprise. The Enterprise arose in the early 1980s as a clandestine network of high-ranking U.S. military officials and Latin American operatives designed to circumvent congressional restrictions on U.S. involvement in Nicaragua. At its core were figures within the Reagan administration, including National Security Council staffer Oliver North, retired Major General Richard Secord, and private operatives such as Albert Hakim and Manucher Ghorbanifar. Together, they constructed a parallel apparatus that secretly funneled arms to Iran and redirected profits to support the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The enterprise relied on arms sales to Iran, despite an official embargo, and laundered the proceeds through offshore accounts. It coordinated weapons shipments using private contractors, clandestine airstrips, and covert supply chains that bypassed official oversight. By design, it operated outside normal government channels, creating a shadow foreign policy immune to congressional checks, and it drew upon a mix of government insiders, intelligence operatives, and private businessmen, forming a hybrid network that blurred the boundaries between state and criminal activity. The impact on Latin America was profound. The enterprise's support for the Contras intensified violence in Nicaragua, fueling civil war and widespread human rights abuses. The chaos created fertile ground for drug traffickers who exploited smuggling routes and weakened institutions to expand their operations. Neighboring countries experienced destabilization as arms and illicit funds flowed across borders, undermining democratic governance and entrenching corruption. By embedding covert operations within Latin America's fragile political landscape, the enterprise fostered an atmosphere of mistrust, violence, and instability that outlived the scandal itself. In academic terms, the enterprise exemplifies the fusion of covert geopolitics and illicit economies, producing a shadow system that eroded sovereignty and entrenched violence across Latin America. In 2016, as part of the peace deal in Colombia, the government created the Colombian Truth Commission. The final report provides a disturbing account of sexual violence and massacres committed by both foreign and national military actors, underscoring the vulnerability of children and civilians in conflict zones and the structural impunity that enabled such abuses. According to the Commission, approximately 49,000 children were victims of sexual misconduct perpetrated by guerrilla groups, paramilitary groups, Colombian state forces, U.S. military, foreign military personnel, and contractors during the years of Plan Colombia, a figure that illustrates the systemic nature of exploitation under conditions of war and displacement. The Commission highlights the case of 59 children raped by U.S. Special Forces, as well as the emblematic incident involving a 12-year-old girl who was assaulted by a U.S. soldier and a contractor. The girl's mother testified before the Commission that the perpetrators told her, "Nothing will happen to us," because they were protected by U.S. jurisdiction, a statement tragically borne out when both men escaped prosecution in Colombia due to status of forces agreements that shielded foreign personnel from local accountability. These findings, corroborated by human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, reveal a pattern in which military agreements and counterinsurgency strategies created what the Commission termed a zone of impunity, allowing grave violations of human rights to occur without redress. The academic significance of these cases lies not only in their documentation of atrocities, but also in their exposure of the legal and political structures that facilitated abuse, demanding a critical reassessment of foreign intervention, military jurisdiction, and the protection of civilian populations in armed conflicts.